Chag Sameach. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Berger, and it's great to spend some time together studying Torah in preparation for Shavuot. I always begin my classes by introducing myself and asking everyone to introduce themselves. Who am I and who are you? Learning together should be a way to build a relationship. It also allows me to make the class into a kind of conversation. This format is harder. We all miss being in a room studying Torah together. But the beauty is that in this time of disconnection, we will be connected by Torah that we study. Sometimes in life, we find ourselves in a situation where we're doing nothing wrong, but it looks like we are. Or maybe it even feels like we are. We feel guilty even though we know everything we're doing is proper. How important is that discomfort? Does it matter if other people think we're doing something wrong? Can our sense of guilt be overdeveloped? The example we'll focus on together is an example from the laws of kashrut. But I think the implications go far beyond. Let's imagine that because of the laws of kashrut, of keeping kosher, you don't eat cheeseburgers. It doesn't make a difference for our imagination right now and for this session if you've never had one in your whole life, or if you're imagining that you used to have them but you decided to stop recently. All that matters is that at this point in your life, if someone were to politely offer you a Big Mac or a Whopper, you'd think, no way, and you'd say, no thank you. Up until recently, you had no problem eating a veggie patty with cheese, assuming it was cooked in a kosher kitchen, or at least in a dedicated vegetarian pan. There were some tasty veggie burgers out there, but one glance or one bite made it clear that you weren't eating beef. The color, the texture, perhaps some visible peas and carrots, all signaled that what you were having was a veggie patty. But over the last few years, with the advent of products like the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger and other such products, something has changed. These foods look and taste almost like beef. Someone could see you eating one and think that you were having a cheeseburger. And if you're like me, it feels extremely weird to bite into one. In fact, I haven't been able to bring myself to do so yet. Now, maybe we should say, who cares what other people think? But as we'll discuss, sometimes it really does make a difference. And maybe we should say that our own instincts are just emotional and that we need to ignore them sometimes. But the ability to say, that's not for me, is an important one in life, and I'm not so sure we should be quick to dismiss it. So we'll try to answer these questions. We'll be considering a food like an Impossible Burger with Swiss cheese melted on top, cooked in a kosher kitchen. Should we be concerned that it looks like a cheeseburger? Should we be concerned that it tastes like a cheeseburger? And in general, do we care about appearances? And if so, why? And again, finally, how might these questions and our answers to them shed a little light on the basic purpose of kashrut, and maybe on how we live our lives as human beings? The first concept that we need to consider is called marit ha'ayin, which means appearances, or optics as we put it these days. And on the screen you'll see one of the verses that serves as a source. The actual context for this verse is a story towards the end of the Torah, when the Jewish people were about to enter the land of Israel. But 2.5 tribes asked if they could stay on the other side of the Jordan. It was good grazing land. They had a lot of sheep and flocks. Could they just stay there and not cross into the land of Israel? They approached Moses and asked, and Moses at first was upset, talked to God, and then came back to them and said, under certain conditions, yes, you can have this land under the other half of the Jordan, even though originally it wasn't God's plan. If you go into battle as the frontline troops and help fight to conquer the land of Israel for the rest of the Israelites, then you can come back here. And here's the key phrase that Moses says. He says, if you do all these things, you shall be clear before the Lord and before Israel. Vehitem nikiim me Adonai umi Yisrael. The context is different from what we're talking about tonight. But it does offer this elegant quote for keeping in mind that we want to have strong and honest relationships with both our fellow human beings and with God. V'hitem nikim me'Adonai umi Yisrael. We want to do the right thing in both God's eyes and in people's eyes. Let's skip forward to the Mishnah, the compilation of Jewish law and practice that was put together around 1800 years ago in the land of Israel. And I'm sharing this source because it's an actual example of an early concern voiced by the rabbis about doing something that was fully permitted but looked bad. The background to the source is that Shabbat in general, according to the rabbis, was a time to refrain from creative labor. The Torah says, Kol melacha lo ta'asu, you shall do no melacha. What does that word melacha mean? The rabbis explained it was creative labor. It was a kind of labor that was used, among other things, to construct the desert tabernacle, the Mishkan. And so, for example, because the desert tabernacle had fabrics that were formed into tents, all the steps used in making fabrics, whether woolen fabrics like shearing a sheep and then carding the wool and then spinning it into thread, or making thread out of linen, were all prohibited on Shabbat. And similarly, activities involved in laundry were prohibited on Shabbat. When you do laundry, you're taking unwearable clothes or fabrics and making them as if they're new. And that kind of activity, which effectively is making something new or useful out of something that was not useful, is exactly what we're supposed to say on Shabbat. This is not my activity for today. 6 days a week, I'll do laundry, I'll weave fabrics, I'll build. On Shabbat, I rest and appreciate. So what's involved in laundry? Activities like scrubbing clothes, soaking them, wringing them to extract the water that we soak them in, and finally, hanging our clothes up to dry. So the Mishnah is considering the case of someone whose clothes got wet while walking on Shabbat. Maybe someone splashed them with water. Maybe they tripped and fell into a pool or a puddle. What happens if you're walking on Shabbat and your clothes are kind of dripping wet? Were the rabbis worried that an observer might think, hey, wait a minute, did that guy rinse his clothes on Shabbat? And the answer is no. The Mishnah says, Mi shenashru kelav baderech b'mayim, mehalech bahen ve'no choshesh. You can walk around while wearing those wet clothes and not worry about whether you're going to wring them out or that somebody else might think that you were doing laundry on Shabbat and wearing clothes that for some reason had been rinsed but not dried. We don't worry about that. But when you get to your destination, let's say to the outer courtyard of your house, you can spread your clothes out to dry if it's not in view of the public. But you can't leave your clothes out to dry in a place which everyone can see. Why not? The rabbis seem to be worried about marit ha'ayin. Someone might walk by and see you hanging up your dripping wet clothes, and they're going to assume that you were doing laundry on Shabbat. Now, wrapped up in this, there are two concerns. One is people might assume the worst about you, about the person hanging up the clothes. I thought he took Shabbat seriously, but I guess he doesn't. And second, this could lead to loss of respect for Shabbat itself. I guess nobody really follows those laws anyway. And first you see someone doing something that looks wrong, and then maybe you yourself do the wrong thing too, telling yourself, nobody really observes this stuff anyway. And both of those conclusions would be unjustified. You do take Shabbat seriously. People do follow those practices. But both those conclusions, though unjustified, would be unfortunate. And they might lead people to look differently at you and at Shabbat. But one more observation that flows from this Mishnah. The rabbis were worried about reasonable conclusions that observers might draw. Right? They were worried about the action of hanging up your wet clothes on a clothesline or spreading them out in the sun. But they weren't worried about simply walking with wet clothes. A reasonable person will assume that you accidentally got wet. So we don't have to satisfy our haters, people who are going to always assume the worst about us. We just have to avoid doing things that might look bad to a reasonable observer. The final slide on this topic of marit ha'ayin, of appearances, actually does have to do with food, and with a very similar issue, in fact. It comes from the important 16th century code of Jewish practice called the Shulchan Aruch. The book was mainly written by a Sephardic rabbi named Yosef Karo. We are looking at a comment by the Ashkenazic rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who added his own opinions and comments to the Shulchan Aruch. And he's describing a situation which could be familiar to us today. V'nahagul asot chalav mishkedim, he wrote. These days, in the 16th century, it's become customary to make milk from almonds and to place poultry in it. Umenichim ba besar of. And why would people do that without worrying? Ho'il ve'eno rak midrabanan. Since it's worth keeping in mind the prohibition against mixing milk and poultry isn't really from the Torah, it's from the rabbis. So that, it appears, can just be done. You want to soak some chicken or cook some chicken in almond milk, go right ahead. But, says Rabbi Isserlis, aval basar behema, meat from flock or herd, like beef or lamb, etc., yesh laniach etzel hachalav shkedim, mishum marit ha'ayin. Let's say you're serving or cooking beef in almond milk. Then we are a little worried about what people might think and the conclusions they might draw. So what do? We leave some almonds right next to the cooking, which will trigger people's thoughts and make them realize what's actually happening. So this builds on the previous sources. In the Mishnah about hanging wet clothes out to dry, the only remedy the Mishnah suggests was laying our clothes out in a private place. But in this source, we see the possibility of displaying a signal of some sort that explains what really is happening. Interestingly, it also says that we're especially worried about bad appearances when it comes to biblical laws. So putting this all together, should I be worried about taking a big bite out of my impossible cheeseburger in public? Well, we're not crazy to worry about that. After all, mixing milk and meat is a biblical prohibition. But all we have to do is to find a way to clarify what we're eating. Because after all, impossible burgers are new. People might not all have experienced them or know about them. So we find some way to do that. It also offers up a possibility that in time, when these things become more common, we won't even need to do that. This actually was the case when it came to kosher meat caterers who might serve coffee after a meal with some non-dairy creamer. When non-dairy creamers were new, it was much more customary to see little signs out just explaining non-dairy creamer, so nobody would think that you were at a kosher event and mixing milk with your coffee right after you had a steak dinner. But these days, actually, when everybody knows you can easily get kosher pareve non-dairy creamers, many caterers don't do that anymore because the assumption people will make is a reasonable one. Oh, that must be non-dairy creamer. So Impossible Burgers, Beyond Burgers, they're all new to all of us. And observers might really think that we're having beef. But we can imagine that in time, it'll become so common that even that kind of signal, the equivalent to leaving some almonds out, might not be necessary anymore. We've considered the question of appearances and whether they have to concern us with our impossible cheeseburger. But there's something else I want to consider, which has to do with our own feelings. It's very common, I think, to develop emotions about our practices. There's a powerful quote that's been ascribed to many different people. Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. Watch your character, it becomes your destiny. In a sense, it's a very Jewish quote because it speaks of the power of actions to shape who we are. But it doesn't quite address the emotional component of our patterns of life. Our habits aren't only the sources of our character. Our habits are also the source of our comfort. we generally grow to love the rituals of our daily life, whether it's a morning cup of coffee or a Friday night Shabbat dinner with our parents. And when we have habits of not doing specific things, then it can feel transgressive to break those boundaries. We take on emotions, and our habits take on emotional valence. On a kosher level, this can mean recoiling from cheeseburgers and other forbidden foods. Some of us might think if we never eat cheeseburgers and we think about eating them. It's a natural emotional byproduct of the habits that we develop. So it's interesting to see in this slide what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah teaches us. He seems to caution us against denying what might be natural desires. He cautions us against making our emotions into the prime reason for our actions. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Minayin shelo yomar adam, efshi libos shatnez. How do we know, he asks, that a person shouldn't say, I don't want to wear clothing made of linen and wool, which the Torah cautions us not to do, for reasons unexplained. Efshi lechol basar chazir. I don't want to eat pork. Where again, the Torah doesn't explain exactly why we're supposed to refrain from eating those animals. Efshi laval harava. Aval efshi uma e'eseh ve'avi shebashamayim gazar alai kach. Instead, our attitude should be, what shall I do? I might want them, but my heavenly parent prohibited these things to me. How do we know that should be our attitude? From the verse he says, Va'avdil etchem min ha'amim liot li. From the verse that says, I have separated you from the nations to be mine, said God. Nimsa, poresh min ha'avera, u'mekabel alav malchut shamayim. What's supposed to be behind these choices that we make is that by separating ourselves from certain actions, we thereby develop a relationship with God. We say, God, we're oriented towards you. We want a relationship with you, and therefore we're going to follow your instructions, not because the pork looks disgusting or might taste bad. It might be delicious. It might look beautiful and tasty, but it might get in the way of our connection to God. So based on this text, I should get over my personal aversion to a realistic-looking Impossible Burger cheeseburger. I shouldn't make my own desires or my own aversions into the basis of why I eat what I eat and why I don't eat what I avoid. Because the whole point of this system is actually to allow me to feel like I'm eating in a holy manner. One final interesting source on this topic to consider. It's a story of an interaction between a woman named Yalta, who was married to a rabbi in Babylonia named Rav Nachman. Yalta said to her husband Rav Nachman, since for any item that the merciful one prohibited to us, God permitted us something similar, and then she gives examples, more numerous ones than I even have on this slide. But for example, God told us not to eat blood. That's from the Torah. But God allowed us to have liver. God prohibited us from eating a certain kind of fat from domestic animals like cattle, but we're allowed to have that fat from a kosher, undomesticated animal like venison from deer. God said not to eat pork in the Torah, but permitted to us, apparently the brain of a shibuta fish tasted like pork. That's what we're supposed to understand from this text. And so on and so forth. And based on all that, said Yalta to her husband Rav Nachman, I would love to have a food that tastes like meat cooked in milk. Now, interestingly, Rav Nachman doesn't say, you're not supposed to want that. He doesn't say, ugh, or gross. He says, I have a solution for you. It happens, even though you don't really do this these days under our current kosher practice, that if a cow, female cow that has udders, is slaughtered in a kosher way, then it might be possible to have the udders from that cow, which might retain a milky taste, but they're still meat, and you could roast it and have it. Now, again, we might not all want to rush and put that on our menus for the next Jewish holiday, but his point was there's a way to have what you want. That taste that you might think is prohibited to you, it's not about the taste. And in fact, Not just like in the previous slide where we're not supposed to say that the taste is disgusting to us. There may actually be a way to enjoy it, just in a Jewish way. So, based on this text, interestingly, we could even say that it's God's will that we have impossible cheeseburgers these days. Because God wants us to have an avenue to taste that thing that maybe otherwise we thought we couldn't have. We've talked a little bit about all these implications about this question regarding the purpose of kashrut. Why do we keep kosher? Building room in our life for a relationship with God. And doing certain things and not doing certain things. Because we can't have a relationship with God if we only make choices based on our own pleasures or our own aversions. I think that this principle extends beyond impossible cheeseburgers. The fact is that there are times in our life where we might be faced with a certain choice, and it might occur to us, how does this affect how people view us and our role in the community? And I like the guidance of these texts, right? They don't tell us, it doesn't matter what anybody thinks, because the fact is, Judaism wants us to be part of community and to be connected to each other. And if that's going to be the case, then what people think of us can make a difference. But at the same time, we're allowed to, and in fact encouraged to act, with the assumption that they'll judge us favorably, that they won't assume the worst, but rather they'll assume the best. And with that in mind, we can make our best choice. I think it's an important lesson. And I also believe the second aspect, that sometimes in crafting our religious lives, when we naturally get emotionally attached to things that we love, and we might naturally say, oh, that thing that I don't love as much, that's not for me, we should remember that what we're really trying to do is clear room in our lives to build a God-centered life, so that our lives can be holy, that our relationships with human beings and with God can be strong. My bracha for all of us this Shavuot, and for days and weeks and months and years to come, is that we can all find our own paths to holiness, and we can all build these strong relationships. And finally, that we can all have a Chag Sameach.